Great. So thanks for doing this. Tell us a little bit about yourself. I know it's hard to do in the few minutes as your life's journey has taken so many turns. First working as a map maker in the US during the American War, then getting involved in the anti-war movement in Vietnam, as well as in the United States when you were a student here. And then now, of course, as a professor up in Maine.
The map making thing was an accident, but it played a big part in my life, and also, it conditioned me, if you would like to use the word, to become an activist. Because in Vietnam, back in the late 50s, it was very difficult to go from one village to another. You have to get an internal passport, to go. And if you go from one place to another without that internal passport, you could be thrown into jail at any time. Now, I happen to study English by myself. That's why I still have an accent. I memorized Dickens' Great Expectations with a small dictionary without any guide to pronunciation. So at first I pronounced English words like anyway, pronunciation instead of pronunciation. But I memorized Dickens' Great Expectation. And although I have an accent, it's just still, I don't try to change it. Just like Kissinger, anyway. But one day I used to, because of my knowledge of English, and I was one of the best in Saigon at that time, I was allowed to go, I was invited to the Sex Sportif, which is an exclusive country club in Saigon. And I overheard some of the American generals saying that they wanted to make military maps of Vietnam. So I knew right away that they were preparing for war. And I wanted to see Vietnam. So I said, hey, if you send the wrong people out to the countryside, some of them would get killed very quickly. So 2 months later, 2 Filipinos were killed. Filipinos were working in a group called Vera Cruz. So after the Filipinos were killed, the American generals met me, with me again. I said, hello, how do you know? So I lied to them. I said, my father is a sociologist, so he knows Vietnam very well, and he told me some of this thing. So they said, so they interviewed me to talk with me, and they said, how about, but because you are still very young, I was only 16 at the time, 59. So you are working with a very close group and not directly with the military attaché. And as a result of that, I traveled throughout Vietnam with one of the 5 mapping groups, and I was in the head group. And I saw what was happening in the countryside. I saw the home pacification program. At that time, they called it the agroville, the strategic hamlet. And I saw the people who starved. And then in 1960, I was sprayed on by Asian white and Asian orange. That was June of 1960. And later on I read in Newsweek, and Newsweek also had a report. And so I was, in a word, I knew what was happening, and that was why I became anti-war even while in Vietnam. And that was also one of the reasons why it was very difficult for me to get out of Vietnam. But my CIA friends said, Long, you get the hell out of here, because if you don't, one of these days we'll arrest you. Because I was an activist, and in 1964, General Nguyen Khanh replaced General Dung Van Bích Minh, as Prime Minister, and General Khanh, with American advisors from Harvard, from Yale, from Columbia, and other places, created what was known as the Vũng Tàu Constitution. Vũng Tàu is a city southwest of Saigon, next in the coast area. The name of that is Cape Saint Jacques.
Mhm.
Captain Jacques in French. And that was the Constitution. One of the clauses in the Constitution was to require the Vietnamese population to provide food, clothes, so forth and so on, to the Saigon troops if the war happened, comes about. They also were required to quarter troops. Now, I knew something about the American Constitution. I knew something about American history. And this is something that a lot of Americans way back opposed to. So I said, the United States was going to Vietnam to try to nation build. And they're not nation building Vietnam. They are just, creating a Vietnam that was never, part of the United States. So we oppose the Nguyen Khanh regime, and we burned the, students and I and some of the Buddhist people, we burned the Constitution right in front of the Independence Palace. And General Nguyen Khanh came out, and he witnessed it, and we gave him a copy. We asked him to burn. And so the Saigon regime got very angry at us, and so even though I already had a scholarship to Harvard College, they refused to allow me to go. But because of that, I became famous.
Yeah.
And I play, I play the thing, I don't want to go into the details here, but I did not arrive in Boston until October 14 of 1964. That was Columbus Day then. So I joke with my friends that, that I discovered the United States. But because of the publicity that generated in Vietnam, when I arrived at the Boston airport, they emptied the Pan Am flight, and I was the last person to come out. And then there were a lot of photographers taking pictures of me, reporters. And the very first question they asked me is, how do you feel being the first Vietnamese ever to attend Harvard College? Directly from Vietnam, and I said I was very grateful to the United States. I was grateful to the efforts to get me to the United States. And this is, for that, gratitude. I would like to warn the American people that the United States was going to send troops to Vietnam very soon. And that caught a lot of attention of a lot of people. It caught attention at Harvard. It caught the attention of Henry Kissinger. It caught the attention of Henry Kissinger's teacher and mentor, Professor William Yandong Elliott. It caught the attention of Sam P. Huntington. And Sam P. Huntington was a friend of Brzezinski. And I met the two of them for years. Anyway, that's another thing. And then on the other hand, it caught the attention of people like Noam Chomsky at MIT, Howard Zinn at BU. And they were very curious about why I said such a thing. So I met them and explained to them. And so the rest of the story.
So when you arrived here and you started studying at Harvard, you did get involved with the American anti-war effort. How was information getting from Vietnam to the anti-war movement? Were you hearing about the bombing in the spring and in Laos and Cambodia? And how are you spreading that across the US?
I got a lot of those of the information. Information from Vietnam came to me every day. Because my friends in Vietnam knew a lot of American reporters, and I also knew a lot of American reporters. So they sent these material to me through the APO. And so, I'm an airmail 3 days later, at the, late, longest would be 4 days. So I got a lot of those information. I compare the information from Vietnamese newspaper, French newspapers, or whatever. And then I wrote memos to a lot of people. And that was why, for example, Sam P. Huntington, he died now. and a lot of other people, including Kissinger, they wanted me to brief them on what was going on in Vietnam.
This is back in the day, no fax machine even. We're dealing with what cables back and forth and letters back and forth.
Yeah.
Yeah. And how do you think this information what you were what you were telling the story about what was happening in Vietnam during the war to the people, to the civilians, how do you think that impacted the anti-war movement and then eventually the end of the war? And how much do you think the media was involved in ensuring that we finally did reach an end and we pulled out our troops?
The media, American, at first, until the Tet Offensive, was on. They went to the battlefields. There were helicopter to the rural areas. They were giving conducted tours, so to speak. And then they went back to Saigon and they get briefings at around 5 o'clock, in the afternoon. That was known as a 5 o'clock foley. Not until after the Tet Offensive that they knew that they realized that something was wrong. They realized that a lot of their reports about the battlefields, did not reflect the truth. So they came to me and asked me about what was happening because I already told them about what was happening, in the rural areas, the pacification program and all of that, and what happened in the cities with the students, demonstration with the Buddhists, and so on and so on. And so the new crop of reporters to Vietnam, whether from the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Christian Science Monitor, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, you name it. Mm-hmm. Before they went to Vietnam, they came to me. Mm-hmm. I briefed them. And I put with reporters and people in Vietnam. And so if you read American newspapers, you can see that there was a sea change. They reported more about what was happening with the urban movement, with the Buddhists, the Catholic who opposed the wars and so on and so on. And that was as a result of that. And then I was also the one who told them about the effect of chemicals in Vietnam, Agent Orange. Mm-hmm. And I gave Professor Masterson at Harvard, a number of other professors, at Yale, photos of deformed fetuses and babies, and as a result of this, Masterson and George Wong at Harvard and many other people took me to the AAAS, and I talked to the AAAS 3 times about that, and so they were convinced that the story about the effect of Agent Orange on stillbirths, defects and so on was right, and so they went to the White House, and they forced the Nixon White House to end the spraying of Agent Orange and other chemicals in 1970. Mm-hmm. So I was sick of it, but I did not want to. Recently, Professor Masterson invited me back to Harvard, and in front of other people, I said that I was one of the people who play a part in ending the spraying of Agent Orange. But I was always conscious that as a minority and as a person from Vietnam, I should, be behind the scenes, so to speak, and provide information in different ways, and not to, except that I had to give talks, at rallies and so on and so on. But that's another thing.
Right, during the, it's a very, very important fact. I just got from Art Westing, his archives. He passed away earlier this year, and his widow delivered his archives to me that I'm just starting to go through, and eventually they'll get probably to Yale. But it's a really interesting story that I think needs to be told more about how academics and students were really involved in changing the outcome of the weapons that were used in the war. It's not told enough. Your chapter in the book, The United States, Southeast Asia and Historical Memory, addresses a lot of the post-war era in Vietnam until the normalization of relations. Why did the US impose such a harsh embargo on Vietnam after the war? And what were some of the immediate and the long-term implications in Vietnam, as well as to the US, especially as the Soviet Union filled that void after the US closed relations?
A lot of people thought that the war ended in 1975, but that was not true. The United States, because of pressure at home, had to end the military part of it. But the United States wanted to continue with the war. So what happened here is that the United States used China to put military pressure on Vietnam, while the United States put economic and diplomatic pressure on Vietnam. So the roles changed, but the war continued. What I'm trying to show in that article was because I was asked to follow up Noam's article. And so I just want to talk only the part after the war. But what I tried to imply, or I tried to explain very, very briefly, was that the effect was not on the regime itself, but on the civilian population, on the ordinary people. And that was incredible. Had it not been for the trade embargo, the regime in Vietnam would not have moved people out of the cities into the so-called new economic zones. And later on, they would not have created the cooperatives. They could, in the northern part of Vietnam, they created the cooperatives in order to fight the war, because they needed, to get the human resources out of the countryside in the north, taking the males and so able-bodied females out of the countryside, out of the villages. So in order to maintain production, they had to have a cooperative system. And the reason why the people in the north had to put up with the cooperatives was because in the north, depending on where you were, they had 1,000 years, 500 years, 600 years, or whatever of communal land. So they were used to that communal, kind of production, but not in the South. The South was always private. There was never any communal land. So the North decided that maybe in order to provide for the people in the cities and also to provide for people who were fighting along the western border, because Pol Pot moved his troops to the Vietnamese border. China moved its troops to the northern border, and they share almost every day. So the northern regime or the new regime thought that if we repeat the model in the north, and create a cooperativization program, then we can feed the population and we can feed our soldiers as well. But that created a lot of reaction from people, and as you know, it caused production to plummet. And I had warned the Vietnamese government, the new government from the very beginning. And as most people now know, that I was penalized for that. I was penalized and I was not allowed to go back to Vietnam until November of 1979. Although I was, for a long, long time, I was the only Vietnamese anti-war activist in the United States. Mm-hmm. And I traveled to all the 50 states for years and years. So given that kind of activity, you would assume that I would be allowed to go to Vietnam. But no, because of my opposition of the cooperative civilization program, my opposition to putting people into re-education camps. And at first, you have to say that at first they said that nobody would be sent to the re-education in 6 months, only about 30 days or something like that. But because of the impending wars on the northern border and on the western border, they were afraid that if they release these people, people would become fifth column, right? And oppose the regime from within. So the trade embargo against Vietnam, along with the military pressure along the border, caused the Vietnamese to change, their post-war policies. And that was disastrous. That was disastrous for several decades.
I have a question about the domestic impact of the
Yeah.
embargo, because in this chapter, you also discuss the ways that the embargo was catastrophic to rural populations in South Vietnam in the
Yes.
beginning, with many ultimately experiencing poverty and being forced to eat grass, bark, and cacti. How do you see this mass impoverishment still impacting rural populations today? How did
It's
this poverty?
much better now because of what was known as Đổi mới, which means the reform. But let me explain a little bit about why it was disastrous in the first place. During the war years, the United States sprayed the chemicals, not only in the forest. It's not defoliation. It was an anti-crop program. I reported this, but Professor Westing reported that, Professor Pfeiffer reported that, many other people reported this. So it was an anti-crop program. They killed a lot of rice fields, a lot of banana trees, and so on and so on. By the way, let me digress here a little bit. There was one thing that was known as Asian white. And Asian white is tordon, T-O-R-U-O-N. When you spray, and it's against vegetation in the grass family. So when you spray this, on rice, the rice would, collect a lot of water and it explode. Same thing with bananas, same thing with a lot of grass. That's how you kill the crops, right? So after they kill the crops, then they had, by they, I mean the United States, had what was known as a PL-480. PL-480 is what's called Food for Peace program. So during the war years, half of the rice produced in the United States, Texas, California, Louisiana, so on and so on, was sent to Vietnam. A third of that was sent to Israel and Egypt. The rice was sent to Vietnam as aid, you see. So basically it was given free to the Saigon regime. When it was given free to the Saigon regime resell it to the population at very, very low price, therefore creating tremendous problems for the people in the rural area, because there was no way that they could compete with something that was almost free. So the Saigon regime could always lower the price and destroy the Viet Cong, so to speak, because the peasants in the rural area supported the Viet Cong, right? Then after that, they brought in what was known as the miracle rice or the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution, by the way, started at the University of Maine. And the scientific thought of that was sent to Mexico, for corn there. And then it eventually sent to the International Rice Institute in the Philippines. And so they created a new variety of rice. It was called the miracle rice, which had short stalks, big short stalks, and you can plant this thing very close to each other. The only thing, I shouldn't say the only thing, but in order to grow this miracle rice, you need a lot of liaison or electric pumps to pump the water. Fertilizer, you need a lot of insecticides, because before that, the Vietnamese peasant would grow, one plot of, with this variety, another plot with another variety, and so on and so on. And so if the weather changes, you see, one plot may be wiped out, but the other plot will survive. If you have insects, one plot would be wiped out, but another plot would survive, and so on and so on. During the 70s, in the late 60s, 70s, this miracle rice was grown almost everywhere in the Mekong Delta. So when the war ended, the new government or the new South Vietnamese society was deprived of the fertilizer, was deprived of the chemical fertilizer, was deprived of the oil for running the liaison pumps, was deprived of insecticides. And as a result, what came about, and you read the newspapers, for 4 or 5 years, they had what was known as the green hoppers and the brown hoppers that killed a lot of the crops. And that was the reason why it caused tremendous, suffering to rural population. And to be fair with the new government, they saw what was happening and they couldn't get the fertilizer, they couldn't get any of these things. So they decided that you replace mechanical tractors and so on and so on, because the miracle rice, needed handheld tractors, to plow deep. And if you do not have that, then you require a lot of human labor. And that was one of the reasons for the collectivization program. So you can see, it caused long-term effect. Now, to answer your question, now you go to Vietnam and you get many varieties of rice. In fact, as early as 2,000 years ago, Vietnam already had 75 different variety of rice. And rice from Vietnam was imported to the southern China. Before that, southern China did not even have rice. But anyway, so the Vietnamese have now reverted back to a lot of their own rice varieties. Last year, Vietnamese rice, one variety was voted as #1 in the world. And this year it's number 2. Yeah, so this rice very good and so on. And because you have new variety of rice, you can sell at higher prices. And you may have a small plot, but you can bring in about 10 times the income of the so-called miracle rice that used to be imported from the United States. I hope that answered part of your question.
It's interesting, but it kind of also reminds me how hard Monsanto is working to bring back genetically modified crops. And you see this pushback in Vietnam, and now I get a deeper understanding about why they would be pushing back.
Yes.
Lynn, I think you had a follow-up question to that.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, this still has to do with the impoverishment and the state of the economy. And in light of everything that you're saying about all the efforts that were made to kind of lift people out of poverty, what was the relationship with the between the embargo and the mass exodus of refugees that left from Vietnam after the war? My mother was one of those people who left in the 80s.
There were 2 waves of mass exodus. The first wave was right after the war. That was 75,000 people. and the Vietnamese, the new Vietnamese governments, North and South, at that time, just basically opened the border and allow anybody to leave. Then for a time from 75 to 1980, you did not have refugees, so to speak. Then you had the war with China, and you had the war with Cambodia. And that created second mass exodus from Vietnam. And those people are called the boat people, partly because of poverty, as you say, because wars always bring about poverty, whether you like it or not. Wars always bring about polarization. Wars always bring about differentiation between different social groups, and so if you are really poor and you have no choice, then you have to leave. Or if you are afraid of the war, you also leave. And so the biggest group of people who left Vietnam was actually from after the war with China and Cambodia. But in between 75 and 79 people went out, left Vietnam. And then the other thing is that many of these people who joined later were also the people who were in the re-education camps that I talked to you about. And then after they were released, they had few opportunities, and so they also decided to leave. And that group of people, is a group of people who still feel very bitter about what happened in Vietnam. But the first group was much less so.
Interesting. Whenever I see Mika Brzezinski on MSNBC, I always think of her father, who was the national security advisor to President Carter. What was his reasoning for recommending that the U.S. not normalize relations with Vietnam in 1978, when things were starting to look so promising, and Vietnam had dropped the condition on aid?
He said it out loud. He wanted a proxy war against the Soviet Union. He was a Polish Jew. He hated the Soviet Union, and that was the reason. And he said it very frankly. He said that in his memoir. And he was the one who prevented Secretary Van from normalizing relations with Vietnam. Actually, Van and what's his name? His aide already signed an agreement with Prime Minister Nguyễn Cát Thạch at the UN, and Nguyễn Cát Thạch waited for 2 months in the United States, to go down to Washington. And in the meantime, Van, lost the war to Brzezinski, and he was very, very happy of that. So he said that very cheerfully, in his memoir. I don't know about Kissinger, but Kissinger was a different thing. I knew Kissinger very well. At Harvard, there was what used to be known as the International Institute. The International Institute was created by a professor of mine, William Yandell Elliott. William Yandell Elliott is the father of David Elliott, who was at Pomona. He just retired recently, and his David Elliott's wife is mine, and I knew David's older brother, who was also William Elliott, and in spite of the fact that Professor William Yandell Elliott was a Congo warrior, he was Deputy Secretary of Defense in charge of logistics all around the world, and Eisenhower. met with me, and somehow he hated my politics, but somehow he liked me personally because I challenged him. And so he introduced me to Kissinger. Kissinger was at that time his secretary, running things for him at the International Institute. The International Institute at Harvard is now the Jewish Museum. It's at the end of the Divinity Avenue at Harvard, next to Harvard Yenching. When you go to the front, Henry Kissinger's office was on the right here. Sam Huntington's office was on the left. When I was still in undergrad, I was both a junior tutor and a senior tutor of Sam Huntington. And the reason why he took me on was not because he wanted to be my tutor, but because he wanted me to brief him on Vietnam. and he worked with another professor at MIT on Vietnam, and this professor was a professor who created what was known as HES. HES stand for was that Hamlet evaluation system. And he had a computer company called Civil-Matics Core. And he just put a lot of data junk in there, and then he ran these things out. And I told him that, I'm a junk, garbage coming, goes in, garbage goes out. He hated me for that too. But Huntington used what he knew from me about the villages in Vietnam. That was why he created what was known as a forced draft urbanization program. I don't know whether you heard about this or not. The forced draft urbanization program is this. You drive people from the rural areas into the so-called refugee camps. Mm-hmm. You feed them with some of this rice imported from the United States. And if you see some family, some people who are capable, give them a Honda moped, Honda motorcycle. Because a Honda motorcycle at that time cost from $300 to $5. So Professor Huntington thought that if you can drive them out of the countryside, put them in the refugee camps, they would need food from us, and then we give them, Honda motorcycles, then they would not be revolutionary anymore. So I told Sam Huntington, I said, Sam, has it ever entered your head that, a Viet Cong can ride a Honda motorcycle, but they can still think it like a revolutionary, because they didn't anticipate the urban opposition later on, from the refugee camps, from Saigon, and so on and so on. But anyway, that's a short story. And then, after meeting with Huntington, almost every week, or sometimes every 2 weeks, then I would go to Kissinger's office on the other side and talk with him, and as a result, I took 2 courses with Kissinger. Anyway, as a result, not only I knew the 2 of them, but I also knew Brzezinski, because Brzezinski was at first at Yale, and then he went to Columbia. Brzezinski co-authored a number of books and many articles with Huntington. So whenever Brzezinski went to see Huntington at Harvard, you see, I should not say whenever, but many times, I would join them too. And so I knew this guy, and he was much more anti-communist than Kissinger and Sam Huntington.
Interesting. That makes sense from his background, for sure. If we had normalized relations in 1978, what do you think would have been different? Of course, after this period, the Vietnam-China border war, the incursion into Cambodia happened, and then it was 20 years before we normalized. But if it had happened in 1978, what do you think would have been different?
If the United States signed the agreement with Vietnam, which, Vinh had already initialized, then that would be before the normalization with China.
Mm-hmm.
So in no way then China would dare to attack Vietnam. You see, but then the United States signal, that it was going, it wanted to destroy the agreement. And remember David Truong, the case of David Truong.
Yes.
Yeah, and so they said it because he gave information, classified information to Vietnam, and because he had once or twice went to the UN to meet with the ambassador from Vietnam then, that he must be a spy, and they used that thing to cut off, the agreement with Vietnam. Then when Deng Xiaoping was here, Brzezinski arranged for Deng Xiaoping to be interviewed by ABC, NBC, CBS, and NET at the same time, saying that he was going to teach Vietnam a lesson. And the Washington Post the very next day, said that, they got information. And of course, Brzezinski said it later on, but at that time, the very next day that Deng Xiaoping gave this public interviews, saying that he was going to teach Vietnam a lesson, the Washington Post said that the White House had given permission or agreement to Deng Xiaoping to attack Vietnam. And so after attacking Vietnam, then the war just went on. And by the way, China did not just withdraw from Vietnam, it continued the war until 1985. And that caused a lot of problems for Vietnam. Yeah. And then I don't know whether I said that in my article or not, but somewhere I must have written this. I said Marx used to say that workers of the world unite. Mm-hmm. So I changed that around and said hardliners of the world unite.
Yeah.
Because of the hardline from the United States, the hardline from China, the hardliners from Vietnam got the upper hand of people who were much more liberal, much more progressive. And that was the reason why it was not until things got worse and that the progressive in Vietnam could try to make a comeback, but it's very slow. It was not until 1986. And then it was not until Foreign Minister Vinh unilaterally, pulled troops from Cambodia. Mm-hmm. He only had the support of a number of people, and he declared, he pulled troops out of Cambodia in September of 1999. You see, and when that happened, then it opened things up. But that got China extremely mad, and China demanded Foreign Minister's Vinh said, and so Vinh was kicked out of the Politburo because China and Washington did not want Vietnam to end the war unilaterally. They wanted Vietnam to kowtow both to China and the United States and to pull the troops out in stages with the oversight of the US government. That's what they wanted. During all this time, I was a member of what was known as the Indo-China Policy Forum in Washington, D.C. And the Indo-China Policy Forum in Washington, D.C. was composed of people from the State Department, people from the White House, people from the Pentagon, and people from one senator, or two senators, and two representatives, or whatever. So during this whole time, I was part of that Indo-China Policy Forum, and I knew what was discussed then. So that's what they wanted to do. And Foreign Minister thought, I said, no, I mean, if you pull out unilaterally, they're going to give you a lot of problems, not only Washington and China, but also Hanoi. Mm-hmm. And he said, well, you have to do what you have to do. And that's what he did.
Yeah, I want to go back to Cambodia quickly.
Yes.
So in your chapter, you also mentioned the role of the Khmer Rouge in the border conflict between Cambodia and Vietnam. And of course, during the 1970s, it's estimated that over 2 million people died, including tens of thousands of Vietnamese. And so could you tell us more about the role of the Khmer Rouge in shaping post-war Vietnam, and also how they exist in Vietnamese memory today?
The Khmer Rouge, of course, is you have Pol Pot, Kim, Sun Pham, and others. They were Maoists, and they were very, very leftist. The Vietnamese knew about this, but the Vietnamese did not want to disclose that. But I met Vietnamese, and they knew that horrible things would happen. But they still were talking about, brotherly love, whatever, all this kind of thing, and publicly. Now, I don't know whether you have read Nine Chandra's book, Brother's Enemy, or not. Nine Chandra's book shows that even before Saigon was liberated, Pol Pot troops and Vietnamese troops were helping to liberate Phnom Penh. Pol Pot's troops were killing Vietnamese troops who were helping to liberate Phnom Penh, shooting them in the back. So one book that if you want to read any one book about what happened, in Cambodia, and what happened between Cambodia, Vietnam, and China, Nine Chandra's book would be a book to read. Then shorter articles would be, you would have those articles in, one book is called The Third Indo-China War, co-edited by Sophia Queen Judge. And there are chapters in there, and I also have a chapter in there. So explain this situation very well, so I don't want to go into that here. But briefly is that from the very beginning, China wanted to use the Khmer Rouge against Vietnam. And right away, they massed troops along the Vietnamese border. And they shell across the border. They kill a lot of people along the borders. 50,000 people were killed. And the Vietnamese just did not say anything. They just pulled their villagers back, pulled people back until they could not stand it anymore. And so they attacked what was known as the Parrot Peak, the Parrot Peak area, of Cambodia in December of 1977. And then after they attacked that place, they returned it, saying, hey, we know what you're doing, and we can retaliate if we want to, but we don't want to do that. But nevertheless, that the Pol Pot forces continue with the attack. And not only that, they massed 19 out of their 21 divisions along the Vietnamese border and began shelling. And then during that time, there were about 25,000 Chinese military advisors conducting that. That was what was finally forced the Vietnamese to retaliate, and attack Cambodia. I oppose that because I did not think that that was necessary. But people in Vietnam was afraid that because the border of Cambodia was only 35 miles from Saigon, from the center of Saigon, and China was attacking the northern border. So they were afraid that there would be a pincer movement. And if there's a pincer movement, then Vietnam would not have enough forces to protect both border areas. So they decided to attack Cambodia. But the mistake that they made was that, you see, instead of pulling back like they did in December of 1977, they decided to continue to push and continue pushing Pol Pot to the western border, allow Pol Pot or the Khmer Rouge forces to survive, because China, the United States, supported Pol Pot by sending arms to him, by sending food and so on to his troops through Thailand. And the Thai government was complicit in this kind of thing. Vietnam made a big mistake by doing that.
Both Lynn and I work on addressing the ongoing impacts of the war. Legacies of War addresses the unexploded ordnance issue in Laos,
Yes.
and War Legacies focuses on Agent Orange in Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. Herbicides are still causing harm, obviously, to human health and the environment in both countries, and people are still being impacted by UXOs. How do you think the trade and diplomatic embargoes impacted the ability of Vietnam to begin to help with the post-war recovery and help with the victims? How do you think it would have been different if we had gone right in to start helping people victimized by the war?
Yes, because you see, I mean, until now, of course, you see, most of the aid to Vietnam and Laos, I mean, I would say Laos, but and Cambodia, for a long time came from private groups. I was one of, I was, people may not know this, but I was one of the founders of Oxfam America. I did not want to say, but you see, there were only 5 of us who started this, because we brought people after first thing, if you remember, then we brought Oxfam England to MIT, for a week of conference. And after that, then 5 of us sat in a basement on Commonwealth Avenue in Boston and said that maybe we should do something about that to create Oxfam America. But I never want to be part of any organization. So I continued to be an advisor until 1993 or 95, I think. The reason why I'm saying this is I was very well aware of what was happening in the 3 countries. And so I was the advisor to Indochina. So whenever there was a chance, I would get Oxfam and other groups, the Quaker groups and so on, to send as much aid to Laos and Cambodia as possible. In fact, at one point, Laos got just too much aid. I don't want to say this, but that was true. But when it came to Vietnam, I knew that Vietnam had more reserves and more population. So Vietnam could recover even more slowly. And so, my personal role was to channel as much aid to Laos and Cambodia as possible. In the case of Vietnam, I supported irrigation, rebuilding dams and dikes, and instead of using electric, or diesel pumps, we would build new irrigation ditches and things like that. And small amount of aid, sometimes $5,000, maybe at most about $12,000 a project, but those things help quite a lot. Now, going back to the effect of the anti-crop program, a lot of people now are paying a lot of attention to the after effect of Agent Orange. And of course, you know, it's necessarily so. But they did not just spray Agent Orange. They spray Agent Purple, Agent White, you know, and so on and so on. Now, Agent Blue. Now, Agent Blue is cacodelic acid. Cacodelic acid is 54% arsenic and 54% mixture of whatever. Arsenic does not disintegrate in itself, or the half-life is very, very long. So unless you know Vietnam or Cambodia and Laos, like I myself, because you know when I was a map maker, I also map, or my teams also map part of Cambodia. And so unless you know those places, like myself, you would not know what had been destroyed and what, you know, and why the landscape is like it is now. In many areas, for example, now in Vietnam, I have not been in Cambodia recently, so I don't know, but mostly Vietnam, because Vietnam has the forest hilly thing. Many areas you see things like rock-like mass, masses. The process is called lateralization. Lateralization is when the reddish earth that has a lot of iron and aluminum oxide in that, and it's stripped of vegetation. It's exposed, the soil exposed to the sun, and the sun makes it into rock-like masses. So unless you have been to some areas before, you think, oh, you know, it's the natural escape. But the effect is this. I think, you know, when we had the meeting with Professor Chomsky, I talked about the flash floods in Vietnam now. The flash floods in Vietnam now is partly the problem of deforestation after the war, but that's only part of that. A lot of that had to do with the bombings of the primary forest and also of the defoliation program. The defoliation of the hilly or forest areas usually was done with other chemicals instead of Agent Orange, like Agent Blue, you know, Agent White, you know, Agent Purple, these things. Once upon a time, you shouldn't say once upon a time, as late as 1963, when I was doing a map maker, the overhanging forest was only about 100 yards from the North-South Railway and the North-South Highway 1. You know, and now if you drive along Highway 1 or you are on a train from the north to the south, you can see for miles until the hillside or the mountains to the left. And so whenever the river, whenever the rains come down, if it's heavy rain, it takes only 5 hours to get, you know, from the mountains down to the lowland area or down to the sea. But before that, a couple of weeks. And so, you know, so even tremendous flash floods in the central part of Vietnam, and a lot of people who don't understand or who do not know the history of climate changes or whatever, how you call it, would not know the effect on the population and on the environment of Vietnam.
Ray Burkhart once called the issue of Agent Orange the last ghost of the war in Vietnam. But I often think that the real last ghost is this relationship between, you mentioned it earlier, some of the Vietnamese Americans who came in that second wave, with their relationship with their homeland. I mean, they still see the Vietnamese government as the enemy today. I think that until that is resolved, that will be the last ghost of this war. What do you think can be done to help strengthen those relationships or foster that reconciliation between that group of Vietnamese Americans who are not yet ready to engage with Vietnam? What can the U.S. do? What can Vietnam do? What do you think is possible?
I think I mentioned briefly in my article that U.S. policies toward Vietnam from 2006 on. Before that, the United States was always concerned about MIAs and POWs and things like that. But when the United States started, to help some of the American NGOs, some of the European NGOs to try to tackle with the after effects of the war, that kind of attitude change the attitudes of people in Vietnam. So the people in Vietnam are much more look at the United States in better lights, because people somehow think that an authoritarian government, communist government, does not respond to popular pressure or popular will or whatever. I mean, it's not true. It's not so. I mean, they have, and so as long as you have better feelings from the Vietnamese population in Vietnam towards the United States, that also change the attitude of the Vietnamese here. And I mentioned in my article how after the United States changed its attitude toward Vietnam and think more about the Vietnamese, because for a long time I never thought about the Vietnamese. It was always the United States. The Vietnam War was fought because of the United States in whatever ways. The Vietnamese were secondary. But beginning in 2006 until now, the United States more and more sensitive to the needs of the Vietnamese people, whatever their political bent. And that has made it possible for Vietnamese immigrants or refugees or both people, whatever term you want to use for them, to go back to Vietnam, to invest there, to trade there, to send money back to Vietnam, and so on and so on. Many of the people in the first generation, you see, outwardly, they may be still very anti-communist, and in fact, 99-something% of them are still supporting Trump. But deep down, they are not so. I mean, you see, because there's a lot of intimidation within the so-called Vietnamese community. So even though you may be thinking differently, you don't dare to say so. So you have this, anti-communist pro-Trump thing, I would die in 1919, then support Biden in 2020, and so on, so on. You must have seen that thing. But your question, was also an answer. Many of these people, I am one of the youngest of the first generation of Vietnamese coming to this country, and I'm in my mid-70s now. A lot of these people are old already. You see, they had an impact on the second generation, but not on the third generation. People like Ling must be third generation, right, Ling? And so the second generation became much more progressive. They know English well, they read much more. Many of them go to college, and they don't live within the Vietnamese communities, many of them, because of necessity of jobs or whatever. They live among Americans, and so they they understand American society more, understand things around the world more, and they tend to be much more liberal. So I think that, at most 10 more years, Vietnamese in this country are going to be much more progressive. That's my guesstimate anyway.
That actually has a lot to
And
do
the
with
very fact that you are studying history, you see, your parents may not have been allowed to study history.
Right.
A
Yeah.
doctor, or I'm talking about, or an engineer or something, something to make money. But when you study history, you study art, you study music, something like that, you tend to be, more sensitive to human needs.
That has a lot to do with my my thesis, actually, what you were just talking about, because the reason why I want to trace the relationship between the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement is because a lot of Vietnamese communities today are so conservative, and they, especially over the course of this year, since there have been a lot of Black Lives Matter movements and demonstrations across the country, I kind of want to understand how this relationship between Vietnamese Americans and Black Americans has changed over the decades.
This is something that I would like to add to this. This is something that people don't know. You see, the majority of the people, the grunts, GRUNTS, who died in Vietnam were Blacks and Chicanos, people like that. Yeah, whites in the upper classes don't ever go out into the fields. Gore, for example, former president, Gore was 2 years behind me at Harvard. He would live in Adam's house. I live in Below house. I live in Adam's house. I knew his father from Tennessee. And his father was one of the first Republicans who went out against the war. And his father introduced me to the son. And then when it was time for Gore to be drafted, Gore agonized. He wondered whether he should go to Vietnam. So I advised him. I said, by all means, go to Vietnam, because you would never go out into the field. At most, that make you a reporter in some bases or whatever. You come back, you become a Vietnam War veteran, you become a hero, then use that, for better causes. And that's what Gore did. I knew Gore advisor Newstad, who used to be an aide to Kennedy, and I knew another advisor, Gore, that was what's his name? I remember it very soon. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that the Black soldiers who returned from Vietnam were the first people who came out against the war. In fact, they already came out against the war in Vietnam. And the first person who was the head of the VAW was a Black sergeant. He was a sergeant, he was a Black person. He was a friend of mine. And then you see, a lot of people talk about like Senator Kerry, John Forbes Kerry. I know the Forbes family very well. The Forbes family owned the whole Elizabethan Islands off the Martha Vineyard. I know that very well because, John Forbes was in my same class. And Senator Kerry, he was a few years before me at Harvard. And he happened to just jump in, during a VVAW demonstration or thing at Congress, and he was eloquent, and so he got to be known that way. And so a lot of people think that the white people started VVAW. No, it was Black people, which carry people like that. But what I'm trying to say is this: it was a Black people with the linkage to the civil rights, who supported Vietnamese refugees very, very strongly when they first came. Right. And this is something that I reminded a lot of Vietnamese refugees. I said, I was in the midst of it. These people supported you for so many years. You were racist against them now. Why are you not supporting, what they are doing? And a lot of people, you see, just have this kind of attitude, but they don't know that it was the blacks, it was the Chicanos that did everything possible to help the first and second waves of Vietnamese refugees to this country. And then, of course, the church groups. The Catholic Church was, most churches, but the Catholic Church was also, for different reasons, the Catholic Church is anti-communist. But at the same time, many of the people in the Catholic Church was also anti-war. And so they felt guilty about the war and the kind of thing. So they were also very supportive of Vietnamese refugees. And this is something that I think the Vietnamese communities in this country should understand. Because if you don't understand that history, you don't understand the people who give you a chance, for being what you are today.
The last question I'll ask is, what lessons can we learn from Vietnam and the post-war reconciliation process as the U.S. is now slowly pulling out of the Middle East? What lessons can we learn also from the war, and how to prevent long-term legacies that hopefully people will not be focusing on 50 years after the war like Lynn and I are doing right now?
The one lesson is the United States keep on rationalizing its adventures abroad by saying that it went abroad to nation build. You don't nation build with bombs. You cannot nation build with a war. The longer a war continues, the more you polarize that society. Just look at what happened in Iraq now. Has the United States been able to nation build Iraq? Iraq is in a mess. Has the United States been able to nation build any country that the United States has, intervened directly or even indirectly to have a civil war? You see, because you don't have to intervene directly to create a civil war. And so wars do not nation. And if you want to help other people to build a better society, other means instead of wars.
Right. I think that's a good final statement on a very long, complicated story that this war has in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. So thank you very much.
Yes.
And great
you.
talking to you. I really enjoyed your chapter, and I'm sure Lynn will love to be able to reach out to you as she works on her thesis.
Yes, Lynn, just come back to me anytime. I've worked with the civil rights movement for many, many years. So, I know all about these things and the peace movement. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'll make sure to send you an email. But thank you so much for your time today.
Sure, yes.
And I'll be in touch whenever we sort out where we'll be posting these interviews.
Okay.
Great.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter as long as I get to talk with you too.
All right,
Yeah.
thank you. Great talking to you. And John McAuliffe sends his regards. I was just talking to him this morning. So,
Okay, good. Thank you.
all right.
Thank you so
Take
much.
care.
Have a good
Bye-bye.
day. Bye.
Thank you, Lynn.
Bye.